For 50 years, he worked at the same circus. People thought he was just an old acrobat. Until his granddaughter found coded Nazi officer photographs in his costume chest. 127 targets. All neutralized because of him. Welcome to Silent Legends. Before we unveil the story of a circus performer who entertained by day and eliminated enemies by night, who turned the big top into the perfect cover for the deadliest intelligence operation in wartime Austria, tell me in the comments from which city are you watching this video today? And if you believe the greatest performances sometimes happen where no one expects them, subscribe to witness stories that time forgot, but history never will. Vienna, Austria, March 2005. The attic of the old Zimmermann house smelled of mothballs and forgotten dreams. Wooden beams stretched overhead like the ribs of some ancient creature, and dust motes danced in the pale light filtering through a single window. Emma Zimmermann, 28 and recently graduated from university, had volunteered to sort through her grandfather's belongings after the funeral. Karl Zimmermann had died peacefully at 87, leaving behind a lifetime of circus memorabilia and the memories of audiences who had watched him perform for 5 decades. The family knew Karl as a gentle man who spoke little about his past. He had been an acrobat with Circus Renz, Austria's most famous traveling circus, from 1943 until his retirement in 1993. 50 years of entertaining children, perfecting his craft, and living the nomadic life of a performer. Emma had loved her grandfather's stories about circus life, the camaraderie between performers, the thrill of the spotlight, the satisfaction of a perfect routine. But she had always sensed something deeper in his eyes, a weight that seemed too heavy for someone whose life had been dedicated to bringing joy to others. Now, surrounded by costume trunks and faded photographs, Emma was hoping to understand the man who had raised her after her parents died in a car accident when she was 12. The first trunk contained exactly what she expected: sequined costumes, worn leather shoes, practice equipment, and programs from performances across Austria and Germany. The second trunk held photographs: Karl in his prime, suspended from silks, balancing on tightropes, surrounded by fellow performers. But it was the third trunk, hidden beneath layers of fabric in an ornate wooden chest, that would change everything Emma thought she knew about her grandfather. The wooden chest was heavier than it looked, secured with a lock that had long since rusted open. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth like precious artifacts, were dozens of photographs. But these weren't circus pictures. They were surveillance photographs. Military officers in Nazi uniforms, captured in candid moments, sitting in restaurants, walking down streets, entering buildings. Each photograph was labeled with meticulous handwriting in Karl's familiar script, but the notations made no sense for circus documentation. Target 47, SS Oberfuhrer Heinrich Müller, Vienna State Opera, March 15, 1943. Target 73, Oberst Ludwig Krantz, Hotel Imperial, July 22, 1943. Target 105, Major Klaus Dietrich, Café Central, December 3, 1943. Emma stared at the photographs, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. Each image showed Nazi officers in civilian settings, unguarded and unaware they were being photographed. And each photograph bore a small stamp in red ink, neutralized. But it was the photograph at the bottom of the stack that made Emma's hands tremble. It showed her grandfather, not in circus costume, but in civilian clothes, standing beside a man in an expensive suit. The man's face was familiar from history books, a high-ranking Nazi official whose name Emma couldn't immediately recall, but whose presence in her grandfather's collection meant something far more significant than circus performances. On the back of this photograph, in Karl's handwriting, was a single line: Final performance, May 8, 1945. Mission complete. 127 confirmed eliminations. Emma spent the next 3 days in the Vienna State Library, researching everything she could find about Circus Renz during the war years. What she discovered painted a picture very different from the family stories she had grown up hearing. Circus Renz had indeed traveled throughout Austria and Germany during the war, but their routes followed suspicious patterns. They performed almost exclusively in cities with major military installations, Nazi party headquarters, or strategic industrial facilities. More intriguingly, the circus had enjoyed unusual protection and funding during a time when most entertainment was severely restricted. Dr. Heinrich Braun, a historian specializing in wartime Austria, agreed to meet with Emma after she contacted the university. When she showed him the photographs, his reaction was immediate and intense. "Miss Zimmermann," he said, studying the images with magnifying glass, "these aren't just surveillance photographs. These are intelligence assets of the highest order. See these notations? This is operational code work. Your grandfather wasn't just taking pictures, he was conducting targeted elimination operations." Dr. Braun explained that during the war, the Allies had operated several deep-cover networks throughout occupied Europe. Some agents posed as merchants, others as clergy or laborers. But using circus performers was particularly brilliant. Circus people move constantly, have access to all levels of society, and no one suspects a performer of being anything other than an entertainer, Dr. Braun explained. Your grandfather could get close to high-ranking Nazi officials in social settings where they felt safe, opera houses, restaurants, private parties where wealthy collaborators entertained their guests. The photographs showed a systematic operation spanning nearly 3 years. Each target was carefully documented, their routine studied, their vulnerabilities identified. And the red, neutralized stamp suggested that Karl Zimmermann had been far more than a surveillance operative. #. Further research revealed that Circus Renz had been part of something called Operation Spotlight, a joint British-Austrian resistance network that used traveling entertainers to gather intelligence and eliminate high-value Nazi targets throughout the German sphere of influence. The operation was elegant in its simplicity. Circus performers had legitimate reasons to travel, access to venues where Nazi officials felt safe to socialize, and the physical skills necessary for infiltration and elimination work. A skilled acrobat could scale buildings, navigate restricted areas, and disappear into crowds in ways that traditional agents could not. Karl's role had been particularly crucial. As the circus's lead acrobat, he performed for audiences that included Nazi officers and their families. These performances became reconnaissance missions, opportunities to study security arrangements, identify targets, and plan eliminations that would look like accidents or natural deaths. The photographs Emma had discovered documented a 3-year campaign of systematic elimination. Nazi officers who attended circus performances would often die within days, heart attacks, accidents, sudden illnesses that aroused no suspicion in a time when death was commonplace. Dr. Braun showed Emma classified documents that had been declassified in 2000. Operation Spotlight had eliminated 347 Nazi officials across Austria and Germany between 1943 and 1945. Karl Zimmermann had been personally responsible for 127 of those eliminations, more than any other single operative in the network. Your grandfather was one of the most effective intelligence operatives in European history, Dr. Braun told Emma. He saved thousands of lives by eliminating Nazi commanders who would have ordered executions, deportations, and military operations against civilian populations. But the most revealing discovery came when Emma found Karl's personal journal, hidden in a false bottom of the costume chest. Written in a mixture of German and code, the journal revealed the emotional toll of his double life. "Performance tonight went well," read one entry from October 1943. "The children laughed at my pratfalls, and their parents applauded the silk routine. Afterward, I shared wine with Oberst Brenner and his wife. She showed me pictures of their grandchildren. By tomorrow, he will be dead, and those children will be orphans. This is necessary, but it is not easy." Another entry, from December 1943, 3 eliminations this week. Each one successful, each one bringing us closer to the end of this war. But I dream now of empty circuses, silent crowds, applause that echoes in empty tents. When this is over, will I remember how to perform for joy instead of as cover for death? The journal revealed that Karl had volunteered for Operation Spotlight after witnessing Nazi atrocities during a performance in Salzburg. He had seen families being loaded onto trains, children separated from parents, the systematic destruction of communities he had entertained for years. His decision to join the resistance had been immediate and absolute. But the psychological cost of maintaining his cover while systematically eliminating targets had been enormous. For 3 years, he had been two people, the beloved circus performer who brought happiness to children, and the silent assassin who eliminated their oppressors. The final revelation came when Emma discovered correspondence between Karl and British intelligence officers after the war. The letters, dated 1946 to 1947, discussed his transition back to civilian life and the creation of a cover story that would allow him to continue performing without anyone discovering his wartime activities. Karl had been offered honors, recognition, and financial compensation for his service. He had refused everything except one request: that his circus work be allowed to continue, that he be permitted to spend the rest of his life bringing genuine joy to audiences instead of using performance as cover for elimination operations. The British had agreed, helping to establish the official story that Karl had simply been a circus performer who had managed to maintain his career throughout the war years. All records of Operation Spotlight were classified, all participants sworn to secrecy, all evidence buried in archives that wouldn't be opened for 60 years. For 50 years after the war, Karl Zimmermann had performed as a genuine entertainer. He had taught young acrobats, delighted audiences across Europe, and built a reputation as one of Austria's most beloved circus performers. But every night, he had carried the weight of 127 lives he had taken, 127 eliminations that had helped end the war and save countless innocent lives. Emma realized that her grandfather's gentle nature, his reluctance to speak about the past, his dedication to bringing joy to children, all of it had been his way of finding redemption for actions that had been necessary but had cost him part of his soul. 6 months later, Emma stood before an audience at the Vienna Museum of Military History. The museum had organized a special exhibition on Operation Spotlight, finally acknowledging the circus performers who had risked everything to resist Nazi occupation. Karl's photographs, journal entries, and performance costumes were displayed alongside materials from other operatives in the network. But the centerpiece of the exhibition was a simple placard that read, "In memory of those who performed the ultimate sacrifice, not on battlefields, but on stages, where entertainment masked elimination, and where the greatest performances saved thousands of lives." Emma had decided to share her grandfather's story not to glorify violence, but to illustrate the impossible choices faced by ordinary people during extraordinary times. Karl Zimmermann had used his talents as a performer to serve a greater purpose, sacrificing his own peace of mind to help end a war that was destroying everything he loved. The exhibition included testimony from families of Nazi officials who had been eliminated during Operation Spotlight. Rather than expressing anger or resentment, many had expressed gratitude that their relatives had been stopped from committing further atrocities. The children and grandchildren of Nazi officers had lived with the knowledge of their families' complicity in genocide. Karl's actions had prevented even more blood from staining their family histories. At the end of her presentation, an elderly man approached Emma. He introduced himself as James Fletcher, a former British intelligence officer who had coordinated Operation Spotlight from London. "Your grandfather saved my life," Fletcher told Emma. "Not directly, but by eliminating Nazi officers who would have captured and executed British agents operating in Austria. He also saved thousands of Austrian civilians who would have been killed in reprisal operations that those officers were planning." Fletcher handed Emma a letter that had been sealed for 60 years. Karl wrote this in 1947, to be delivered to his family if his story ever became public. "I think it's time you read it." The letter was brief, written in Karl's careful handwriting. "To my family, if you are reading this, you have learned the truth about my wartime activities. I hope you understand that everything I did was to ensure that you would grow up in a world where circuses exist to bring joy, not to provide cover for the work of war. The greatest performance of my life was not on any stage, it was the 50 years I spent trying to become, once again, a man who created happiness instead of eliminating those who destroyed it. I love you all." Karl. Have you ever discovered that someone you thought you knew completely had lived an entirely different life? That the gentle person who raised you had once been called upon to make impossible choices in impossible times? Share their stories in the comments. Because legends like Karl Zimmermann remind us that heroism isn't always loud, isn't always celebrated, and sometimes requires spending the rest of your life trying to find redemption for actions that saved the world but cost you your peace. Thank you for watching Silent Legends. If this story moved you, subscribe and help us honor those who were never meant to be forgotten. Because sometimes the greatest performances happen not for applause, but for the simple hope that future generations will never need to perform such roles again.